our final meeting of the Kansas Transition Task Force and the adoption and release of our final recommendation.
That's right, Sam, and good morning, everyone. You have a copy of the final report in front of you, and Sam and I want to thank all of you for your participation throughout this important process, but also for your careful review and feedback of the draft. I think we have a report that Kansas can truly be proud of.
Absolutely. Now, today's meeting is going to be brief, probably, with our main item of business really just being the adoption and final report for transmission to Governor Kelly, and whom we're thrilled to have join us today. Thank you for coming. And the governor will make a few remarks shortly, but before she does so, we've asked Dr. Worry to provide a brief recap of our processes and findings for the benefit of those joining us today. So, Dan, we'll turn it over to you.
Sam, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Worry. I'm the Senior Early Childhood Advisor at the Hunt Institute in Cary, North Carolina. It has been our privilege and honor to help to support Governor Kelly and the task force throughout this process. Sam mentioned that those of you who are sitting at the table have a copy of the final report in front of you for the benefit of those of you who may be tuning in online. These are materials that are available to you as well if you visit the governor's office's website, which is governor.ks.gov. You'll see a tab at the top of the screen that says Newsroom, and under that, Early Childhood Transition Task Force, and you'll be able to access all of those materials. In the interest of time, you'll notice that the report is rather substantial. I'm going to speak very briefly today, just sort of recapping the process that the task force has been through, and really just a couple of the major headlines coming out of the report. And I say that in part just to remind you that the work of the task force has been very, very substantial. And so please don't allow my limited comments to reflect on the totality of the work here. If we can pull up the slides, and we will get started. As a refresher for some of you who may be rejoining us, or maybe as an orientation for those who are joining for the first time, the work of the task force has been focused around early childhood governance, which is to say sort of the configuration within state government and where early childhood programs for children, for families, and for early childhood service providers are housed and configured within the state government here in Kansas. We can move on to the next slide. Just as a reminder, sort of going back to our very first meeting, those of you around the table will recall, this was one of the first slides that we began with. Early childhood governance is a challenge not just for Kansas, and I think I want to reiterate that today in the same way that I did during our very first meeting, in part because of the way federal dollars flow down from the federal government to the states. It is very common, in fact, it is the norm, for early childhood programs to be a bit fragmented at the state level and spread across, in some cases, 3 or 4 or more state agencies at the state level. That is, again, the norm. There is a trend, however, toward addressing that for a number of different reasons. And so right now we have sort of categorized governance models into 3 broad buckets. There is a coordinated model, which is what I would say Kansas has currently, right? So there are programs currently spread across 4 major units of state government here in Kansas. There is an organizing entity, the Children's Cabinet, that attempts to bring the leaders from those organizations together and coordinate services on behalf of the state, which is more, frankly, than many states with this configuration are doing. There is a trend, however, a growing trend in states across the country to look at how to consolidate those services. And states have done that in 2 different ways. They have consolidated programs within existing agencies, either in whole or in part. There are states that Missouri, as an example, as a neighbor, has consolidated all of their early childhood programs into what is known as the Office of Childhood within the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. There are other states that are doing this a little bit more incrementally. Delaware is a state that we've worked with recently that has begun the process and is moving maybe one or two programs at a time. So they began by moving child care licensing into the Department of Education, for example. So coordination, consolidation. The third category is creation, which is that there are a number of states that are looking at the creation of brand new early childhood cabinet agencies in which to house all of these programs. New Mexico is a good example of that. Oregon, Colorado, a number of states have created cabinet agencies with which to do this. And the reasons are sort of spelled out for you on the screen. When we have fragmentation, and this flow chart may be a bit of an exaggeration, but maybe only a bit of an exaggeration in some cases, there is a tendency for programs to become fragmented. There is duplication of cost, duplication of effort. There is the potential, at least, for the suboptimal coordination of resources, suboptimal collaboration. But most importantly, these systems create, albeit very inadvertently, bureaucratic mazes for families. So imagine being the parent of a young child in need of services and learning that the services your family may need to access are located within 4 different state agencies, each with their own application process and eligibility criteria. So that's sort of the impetus for some of this conversation across the country. One of the drivers of the conversation here in Kansas, I know, is that recently our colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., put out a set of state rankings looking at the efficiency of state early childhood systems. They ranked Kansas 48th in the nation earlier this year on the basis primarily of the fact that we've got these services spread across 4 different agencies here in the state, which leads us really, that's sort of the context, the background as to why we are here. If we go on to the next slide, we can talk about the work of the task force itself. So in January, Governor Kelly issued Executive Order 2301, which created this Kansas Early Childhood Transition Task Force and charged it with a number of different responsibilities. First, asked that the task force come together and examine Kansas's existing early childhood landscape, systems, resources, where is the money, where are the employees, and so on. For those of you around the table, this is going to now start to sound familiar. This was the topic of our very first meeting. You'll recall that we put together an 85-page inventory that is linked in the final report. I think we decided to spare some trees and not reprint it here, but it is linked in the final report. So we looked at where are all of these programs. Also Governor Kelly asked that we explore the lessons that were there to be learned from other states. As I mentioned in the opening, a number of other states have moved in this direction over the past couple of years. And you'll recall we spoke with leaders from Colorado, we spoke from leaders from Missouri on how they have gone through this process. The governor also asked that we elicit stakeholder feedback. And you may recall that during the last week of June, we were involved in a community listening tour around Kansas, visited 9 different cities in 4 days, and heard from nearly 500 Kansas stakeholders on the efficiency and of the system and their primary needs. Also held an online version of that so that we could incorporate some who weren't able to be there in person. And then finally asked that we bring forward by January 1st a set of recommendations for the creation of a consolidated entity. And that is exactly what the final report here does today. Next slide, please. So again, we have met for 5. This is our 5th in-person task force meeting, 3 virtual work sessions. I mentioned the community listening sessions, 1 interim report in July, and then today the final report. And so over the next 3 slides, I want to again share just sort of the big headlines in 3 different categories. You recall that we broke into 3 working groups. We have 3 separate categories of recommendation. We can move on to the next slide. And the first of those is in terms of transition logistics. So the very big headline, Governor, coming out of this report is a recommendation that Kansas should consolidate its governance of early childhood programs into a single state entity, reforming what is now a coordinated model that I talked about into either a consolidated model or the creation of a new entity. You'll see throughout the report that we have chosen the words consolidated entity to leave really maximum flexibility. I think we've had really robust conversations across 5 meetings. Conversation around sort of the political reality and the will that there may or may not be a will to create a new state agency, but I think a general consensus among the group that consolidation is necessary, regardless of whether that happens within an existing entity within state government or the creation of some new entity. And so the task force has not taken a position on exactly where this needs to be housed, but has definitely taken a position that it needs to be happen. You'll see in the transition logistics section that the task force has also spelled out at least a recommended timeline, which begins very shortly. Here in January, the hope being that between January and May, during the upcoming legislative session, that there is an opportunity for you, Governor, to work with the legislature to establish whatever this structure may look like, that as that happens, that there is an opportunity to bring on a transition director who would be sort of limited in their service. This is someone that would not serve as the permanent full-time director or secretary of the agency, but would be brought on to help to manage the transition with the hopes that this new entity, whether in an existing agency or a new one, would be launched by July 1st, 2025, under then a permanent director. If we can move on to the next slide. As you might imagine, one of the most challenging parts of this conversation, recognizing again that we put together this 85-page inventory of, there are a lot of programs. There are a lot of employees. There is a lot of public funding involved here. And so, a part of the task force's work was making recommendations around which programs should move, and in some cases, maybe which ones should not move, that there are some compelling reasons not to. So the big headline here in terms of programmatic movements is that a unified entity should co-locate a variety of programs, but in particular, those relating to childcare. The Kansas Children's Cabinet and Trust Fund is recommended as a part of this consolidated entity. Home visiting programs, I think that's one of the things that during our very first meeting, the task force recognized was a place with an awful lot of fragmentation across the 4 different entities. Each reported out on their connections to home visiting programs, in some cases the same home visiting programs. And we heard from providers around the state what challenges that creates for them in terms of reporting to multiple different entities. That the Head Start Collaboration Office and the Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships be housed under this entity. But you'll note on the screen that there were a couple of cases where the group pulled back and said, it makes sense potentially to leave certain programs for a variety of different reasons where they are. So not recommended for movement at this point are any preschool programs that are currently being operated under the auspices of the Kansas State Department of Education, child health programs, which make sense to stay within the Medicaid agency, and also child welfare programs, which make sense to stay where they are. Finally, if we can move on to the last slide, there is a set of recommendations, and frankly, a pretty lengthy set of recommendations around metrics and data. The task force spent a good bit of time talking about how will we know that this new entity is being successful, and how will we know that the state is being successful? And so, as a point of maybe personal privilege, I will just mention, I have worked now over the past couple of years with many of the states that I referenced: New Mexico, Colorado, Oregon, Missouri, as they created their consolidated entities. Kansas and this process has been special, from my perspective, in the amount of attention and focus that has been placed on this question of how do we know if it's working. And so I would commend all of you for your focus there. I think that this is a place that, as our work goes forward at the Hunt Institute, that I will absolutely be pointed to Kansas and to this task force as national leaders in this space. It is not uncommon, and frankly, this is a very challenging thing to coordinate. This is like a large corporate merger in lots of cases. And so, given the size and the scope, it's not uncommon that some of the proposed metrics are around things like, on day one, everybody's email address is going to work, or that, that we're sure that payroll is going to function from day one, or that providers will receive their payments. This group has gone far beyond that and really looked at what are the outcomes that we're hoping to see for children and families in the state. It's a long list. I won't go into it directly, but would definitely commend to you to look through that section of the report. There are two types of metrics that are spelled out there. One set that I think will speak to the effectiveness of the consolidated entity itself. But then there are also metrics proposed in there that will help to sort of look at Kansas's progress for children and families writ large, that may be metrics that extend even beyond the direct scope of this new entity, and speak to kind of the interagency collaboration. So definitely encourage you to look at that. And also, maybe we'll close by just mentioning that I think there's been a very strong sentiment within this group that that's an area to move on quickly, right? That we recognize that if on July 1st, 2025, there is a new entity in place, that the time to collect that baseline data is now, right? So that you've got something to compare it to then. And I think that, I feel like I have heard around the table, a collective interest in starting to pull that process together now, even as the legislature and you, Governor Kelly, work on sort of what are the next steps logistically. That's an opportunity to move forward. So with that, I will turn things maybe back over to our co-chairs. I think those are the high-level recommendations. Again, commend to you the full report for lots more detail.
Dan, thank you so much for that overview. We are so grateful to you and the Hunt Institute for your support and guidance through this entire process. Governor Kelly, before we take a vote, we would like to give you an opportunity to provide comment and reflection. So I will hand it over to you. Do you?
I sat in one of those seats for 14 years, and I was never a big talker, but I was a big question asker. And so I needed to change my venue in order to be able to have remarks with you today. I also, as evidence of how much I'm like a legislator, here's my copy of the report, which I have already dog-eared, and have a number of questions that I will be asking as time goes on. So good morning. I am delighted to be here today and very grateful for all the hard work that has culminated in this report. I want to thank Cornelia and Sam, whose leadership of this early childhood transition task force has been invaluable. I also want to acknowledge you, Dan, and your team at the Hunt Institute for supporting the task force and for bringing this national policy expertise to these meetings and discussions. And if I can find my guy, would you give Dan? You're going to get an autographed copy of the report. So, as I'm sure you've gathered by now, early childhood development is a topic that is deeply important to me personally, but more importantly, to the future of our state. Improving the services we provide to children across Kansas is a cornerstone of my primary goal as governor, to make the Sunflower State the best place in the country to raise a family. This is a nonpartisan issue that affects all Kansans, rural and urban alike, and addressing it pays dividends for everyone in this state. It was with high expectation that, as the first official act of my second term as governor, I signed an executive order back in January to establish a task force around early childhood services. I'm pleased to say that the task force has exceeded my expectations with this report. It is a treasure trove of data and well thought out recommendations that we will use as a blueprint to chart a path forward, making early childhood services more accessible and more affordable for all Kansas families. As I was reading the report, I was thinking back to the early days of my administration when, over in the Department of Commerce, we did the first comprehensive economic development strategy that had been done in 35 years. And the blueprint that came from that report has really driven our approach to economic development. And I think everybody knows we've had a major amount of success. I expect that this will become the blueprint for the future of early childhood education and care in our state. The children of today are the leaders of tomorrow. If we want to give our kids the best possible future, then we must give them the strongest possible start. We need to ensure that every child in Kansas receives the quality care and education he or she deserves, starting in the early years, which are crucial in determining the trajectory of people's lives from academic development to healthy development and social mobility. And if the moral imperative was not enough, economically speaking, devoting resources to early childhood care and education is one of the best investments we can make in our state. Nationwide, inadequate child care costs Americans $122 billion annually from lost income, lower income, lost productivity, and sales tax revenue. Expanding access to high quality, affordable child care will allow us to retain and recruit workers and to maintain the historic economic growth we've experienced over the past several years. The overarching conclusion drawn by the task force is that the existing system around children's services in Kansas is inadequate and overly complex. As it stands, Kansas must engage with 4 different state agencies to receive support and access to critical services. These agencies all do great work, but they're doing it in silos, and the lack of coordination among these programs leads to redundancies, inefficiencies, and barriers for families seeking services. We need to consolidate and streamline this work in a way that will make it easier for our families to access services, enable the businesses and individuals who provide them to thrive, and make the bureaucratic systems that facilitate them more efficient, more effective, and more accountable. The recommendations in this report lay out a vision for putting Kansas on the map to having the most comprehensive, robust early childhood system in the country, and to build a stronger, more prosperous Kansas for generations to come. To the members of the task force, once again, thank you for the time you've given to this issue over the last year. While this meeting celebrates the end product of your work, it's really just the start of our statewide journey to create transformational change in this sector. I hope all of you will consider staying engaged in this work as we determine how best to move these recommendations to fruition. In the meantime, I hope you all have the deserved rest and joyous holiday season. Thank you.
Governor Kelly, thank you so much for your leadership and dedication to this process and dedication to the children and families of Kansas. Now, this has been an incredibly important process in developing this blueprint, this map, but the real work is in the getting there. And I want to say that we all stand ready to help you and our lawmakers in that process, carrying us to the fruition of this plan. And at this point in time, we have one important matter, and which is the adoption and acceptance of the final report. And you'll recall that we adopted the report's final recommendations at our last meeting in October. But at this point in time, we would entertain a motion from the task force to adopt the final report before you for our formal transmission to the governor's office pursuant to Executive Order 23-01. And I'd ask for a motion to approve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the task force adopt the Kansas Early Childhood Transition Task Force final report for transmission to the governor.
Thank you, Senator. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, thank you, Melissa. All right, we have a motion and a second to accept and approve the group's final report for transmission to Governor Kelly. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Same sign. All right, we are accepted. Thank you so much.
Well, with that, the work of the task force is officially complete. On behalf of Sam and myself, we want to echo Governor Kelly in extending our most heartfelt thanks to all of you, and as well as to the Hunt Institute on a job that is very well done. As Sam mentioned, as the governor mentioned, the work is still ahead, right? We've submitted the report, and now it's time to bring this to life. And so it's now in the hands of the governor and the legislature, but I do think that we will all work together to make sure that this work gets done. It is a workable framework, and it is something that I know that we will all take pride in years to come. If there is no further business, we will call this meeting adjourned and wish you all a very safe and happy holiday.